Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by an expert in stress and mental health, Dr. Elizabeth Braithwaite. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Dr. Braithwaite. Let's start off with you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
My undergraduate degree was in neuroscience, so I've always had an interest in neuroscience. I think it's probably stems from the fact that my mum's got MS, so kind of growing up I was quite interested in kind of that and other neurological diseases, so I decided to do a degree in neuroscience. And then during that time I just got really interested in psychiatry and psychology, and I actually did a placement year working for a pharmaceutical company. So I worked for Eli Lilly for a year, and I did research into drug development for schizophrenia, which I really enjoyed, and that kind of got me onto the track of psychiatry type research. And then after my degree I went to do my PhD, which I did at Oxford in the Department of Psychiatry there, and I just had fantastic supervisors. And my PhD was all centred on stress during pregnancy and how that might influence fetal brain development and later child brain development. So I've just kind of fell into it from that kind of aspect, just purely by following something that I was really interested in. And so some of my postdoctoral research has really followed that up, looking at early life stress and developmental psychopathology. But in the last couple of years, I've got into a slightly different field as well, so more kind of occupational psychology. I'm quite interested in kind of what goes on in the workplace with regards to mental health and stress and well-being. So that's kind of the trajectory that I'm on. It's pretty exciting. I get to spend every day doing something that I really enjoy, so I can't complain.
And I understand, of course, since you're doing a lot of research on stress and mental health, you've been often asked, so how does stress affect mental health? So in a nutshell, if you could just describe it to us.
That's quite a question. It's quite a complex situation, really. So I'm quite interested in how stress in very early life can influence mental health, and there's lots of different theories about kind of mechanisms about how that might be. But one of the things that I've been working on for the past few years is thinking about the hormone cortisol, which is the main stress hormone. So this is released when we feel kind of threat within our immediate environment. So this kind of system that results in the release of stress hormone is an evolutionary conserved system, and it's done us really well through evolution, because it means that when we are exposed to threat or predators or rival groups, we can effectively fight or flight, and it enables our survival. What's really interesting is that in our modern environment, obviously we're not generally exposed to those same types of threats, but other stimuli are activating this stress response. So things, for example, like work emails. If you're overloaded with work emails, you get a rise in stress hormone and cortisol. If you have to do a busy commute every day, you get a rise in the stress hormone cortisol. So actually, things in our environment are constantly triggering this system, and we see people who have, who report that they feel very high levels of stress or depression or anxiety. They generally have higher cortisol levels, and that's kind of that you can measure in blood and saliva, but also quite interestingly, you can measure cortisol in hair samples, and that gives you an indication of chronic stress, because that shows how much cortisol has been released over the last 3 months. So there's this kind of interesting mechanism by where we're constantly, this system is being overridden, if you like, getting lots of cortisol, and then that's potentially having long-term effects on our brains and our body, which is resulting in higher feelings of stress. And it's a bit like a cyclical system, because then when you feel more stressed, more cortisol is released, and it has this effect again. But I've been quite interested in stress during early life, so in utero stress, so when mums are very stressed, what that means for babies' development. And what's interesting about this is that so generally babies are likely to, they're about 10% risk of having behavioural, emotional and cognitive disorders. But if mum is really stressed in pregnancy, that risk is doubled to 20%. But what's very interesting about this is even mums who've had IVF, so they're genetically unrelated to their child that they're carrying, they're still at this increased risk of 20%. Their babies are at this increased risk. So this really shows that something biological is going on in the womb when mums are very stressed in pregnancy, that's resulting in kind of later psychopathology for the children. And the main theory here is that this increased stress hormone is actually crossing the placenta, entering the baby's bloodstream, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and then altering neurodevelopment, which means that later on in life they're more at risk of psychopathology. So there's good evidence from animal research that these changes, this elevated cortisol in pregnancy, is actually causing epigenetic changes in the brain. So that's when certain genes are either turned on or turned off. So we've got good evidence that actually this exposure to early life stress is having this long-lasting kind of risk for psychopathology via these biological mechanisms. It's unclear whether in later life this same mechanism might be happening, because in later life our brains are less flexible. However, we do know that they are responsive, you know, our brains and our bodies are responsive to our environment. It's quite difficult to research this in humans, obviously, because you can't expose someone to stress and then take out their brain and have a look at it. So this kind of aspect of research is relying very heavily on animal models, although there is kind of more and more research coming out in humans. So it's quite an interesting, fast-paced research area.
You've given us a biological framework about stress, but could you give us some, ways to manage that stress?
That's a good question. There's lots of different types of psychotherapy and behavioural therapies that are available for stress management. So, for example, mindfulness has been shown to be a very effective form of stress management that's very accessible. There's lots of online material about mindfulness that's very accessible, and a few research groups have been developing ways of delivering mindfulness online, but also at targeted vulnerable groups, including kind of adolescents, and that's been shown to be quite well received and also effective. So this is really the idea that it's giving people the skills and the tools to be aware of their environment, be very much in the moment, and not dwell on negative thoughts, accept that you might have negative thoughts sometimes, but let them go and move on, which is easier said than done. That's quite a skill. So mindfulness training is actually, really skills training and learning some of these techniques that enable you to manage stress in kind of day-to-day life.
Of course, Dr. Braithwaite, another aspect of your work involves looking at how social media may increase risk of poor mental health. Can you talk us more about this? This actually ties in with a previous interview I've done about 2 weeks ago. I was talking to Dr. Nancy Richmond, and she was also talking about, aspects of social media, which is actually detrimental to our mental health.
It's actually really interesting because there's been lots of conflicting research published about the impact of social media on mental health. And again, it's one of these things that's very hard to research and be confident in your results because so many other variables are kind of going on. So I'm more familiar with the research looking at adolescent social media and kind of what adolescents are doing online. And initially there was quite a few publications that came out showing that it had negative effects on mental health. But recently a study by Amy Orban, who's an excellent researcher at Cambridge University, showed that social media engagement wasn't predictive of poor mental health in adolescents. Very large and well-powered study, which is very interesting. And they were looking specifically at internalizing and externalizing disorders, so things like depression and anxiety, but also kind of externalizing symptoms. And again, they found no relationship, which is really interesting. And a theory that I've kind of been working on and thinking about for a long time but haven't actually published on yet is that my theory is that the impact of social media on adolescent mental health is actually indirect. And I think that social media is influencing pro-social behaviour rather than directly influencing kind of symptoms of depression and anxiety. So my theory is that adolescence is a really important time for engaging with peers and learning about how to socialise effectively within groups, so kind of responding to social cues appropriately, picking up on social cues, this kind of thing. And my theory is that actually adolescents are doing more and more of this online. So they're not really kind of face-to-face engaging with their friends so much. They're more kind of texting and typing on chat rooms and whatnot. So they're not having as much time and not having the opportunity to practice this kind of social behaviour so much. So my theory is actually it's not necessarily detrimental to mental health, but actually it's restricting their ability to socialise with their peers. And actually one of the things that we know is a very good protective factor against mental health is this ability to socialise and draw on social support from your family and friends. So my theory is that actually if these adolescents are less able to do that, to draw on their social support, that's where actually the risk then materialises for later mental health problems. But like I say, I haven't actually published on that yet, so this is just me hypothesizing at the moment.
That's fine. Thanks for sharing to us about your hypothesis. And of course, in relation to your work with adolescents, I also found out that you sort of found that sports participation may improve resilience among adolescents. Can you tell us more about this? So what if we're not really like sports minded? Is there a hope for us to improve our resilience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually this is been something again that I've been interested in for a few years, because I've always played netball myself. And until quite recently, until I had my son, I was coaching an adolescent netball team, so a team of under 19s, whole bunch of girls who are kind of 16, 17 and 18, which is a really interesting and fun age to work with kind of sports clubs at this age. And I've got a few colleagues who are sports psychologists, so we kind of got talking about how sports participation might be quite good for mental health. And there's lots and lots of evidence that obviously shows that sports participation in adolescents is very good for physical health. And there is kind of an emerging field now saying it's also very good for mental health, because again, being part of a team, you have more opportunity to interact with your peers, and obviously playing sport releases endorphins. There's potentially many mechanisms by which sports participation might be good for your mental health. However, what I've been really interested in is that as you kind of improve in your sport and you get better and you're competing at a higher and higher level, so as you move towards the elite end of sport, some of the potentially protective factors become risk factors. So for example, you have to sacrifice a lot of time socializing with your friends so that you can train. Obviously you're under a lot more pressure from coaches and parents to perform well. You're also under a lot more kind of scrutiny for your personal performance from your peers and also your coach and your parents. So actually I think that there's a point where sports participation moves from being protective against mental health to actually being a risk for mental health. And this is more in the elite end of training. And we've been running a research study that we're currently analysing the data for, so I can't actually give you an answer on this yet. Still waiting for the statistician to finish analysing this data, but we've been looking over a whole season of a large group of netball players who are all performing at kind of different levels and different ages, and we have a large population that we've sampled multiple times across the season. So they've been reporting on their mental health, their team identity, what they feel about their club and their teammates. So we've got lots of different measures, and we've also got good measures of performance. We've got measures of how they've been performing, so that we can actually look at, is there a U-shaped relationship or is it linear? So for example, are the girls who are playing at the kind of more club level, is their mental health actually better? And then those who are playing at more of the elite level, are they feeling more pressure, and is that affecting their mental health? We've also got quite good measures of sleep, so I'm quite interested in how kind of this elite end, they might be sleeping more because they're more tired because they're training more and the sports participation is at a greater intensity, or they might be sleeping less because they're actually feeling under more pressure and kind of up and thinking and ruminating about how they might not have played well, or there's pressure on their next game. So we've got lots of interesting kind of theories to test in that data set, so that's really exciting.
That line of research actually reminds me of a recent publication at Sacred Journal of Psychology, just published this June. There was a research done by Sophie Kent and Andrew Lane. I forgot the other author's name, but for those of you who are listening, in relation to what Dr. Braithwaite said, there's also a line of research which explored whether at what point actually does sports start building resilience and promoting mental health especially for elite athletes. So I want to go back to my question. So what else can we do to promote resilience aside from sports? That, like myself, I'm not really sports minded.
Sleep is very important, from what we know. Good levels of sleep, and again, it's one of those things that you think might not be under your control, because you go to bed and you think, well, I really need to get 8 hours. But if you're up thinking about things, how does that help you kind of sleep? And again, mindfulness, there's some interesting aspects of mindfulness that help kind of that sleep. And we know from kind of the neurodevelopmental research that sleep is really a really important time for rest and recovery at the neuronal level. Not only for memory formation, but in terms of recovery, and also kind of bringing down our inflammation level, which could potentially improve resilience to mental health disorders. So sleep, some of the clinicians that we work with who deliver kind of resilience training, sleep is always a big aspect, as well as health and exercise and diet. There's always a big emphasis on sleep.
And have you also done some research on, trying to find out why is it that some people seem to be born with the ability to overcome setbacks, whereas some people seem to be, scrambling to build up their levels of resilience?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And again, it comes down to these kind of questions about individual differences. And there's been a lot of research on, I haven't done anything personally, but there's a lot of research on whether some people are genetically more resilient. And a few genes have been identified that link to resilience. So that's kind of an emerging field at the moment. But again, as with all human research, it's very messy. So it's quite hard really to pinpoint kind of what genes might be improving kind of resilience. So it is hard to try and really pin that down. But I think there is kind of general consensus now that resilience, there is an aspect of it that is genetically determined. And then interestingly, from kind of some of the early life stress research that I've been interested in, kind of thinking about whether actually exposure to stressful events actually helps you build up resilience. And there is some evidence for this. So people who are exposed to more stressful events are actually better equipped to then deal with future stressful events. But that's not a really good message to be sending people. You need to kind of be exposed to extreme stress in order to deal with extreme stress. But there is some interesting research trying to understand why that is. So looking at, like I mentioned, so epigenetic changes, different genes in the brain being turned on and turned off in response to this stress. So actually, if and when we get a better understanding of that mechanism, it might help in the future to help people to improve their own resilience if we understand kind of what's going on. And there may be ways to kind of train the body and the mind to kind of simulate that experience so that resilience is improved. But like I say, the research on that is really quite lacking at the moment. So it's all quite new. Resilience in itself is quite a new concept. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I suppose another message is that, well, like what you said, that we can't really expose people to stressful conditions in order to build up their resilience. I suppose what we can, the message that we can tell to people is that try to learn from other people who've actually overcome adversity. Say, for instance, like people in developing countries, they don't seem to experience what you're experiencing, and they experience other situations. So, try to consider your situation in relation to other people. I think that would be a good, kind of message to build up your resilience.
Yeah, definitely. And there's there is a stream of therapy that one of my colleagues does a lot of research in. It's called rational emotional behavioral therapy, and that one of the kind of key concepts of that type of therapy is just that kind of putting your own stress into context in in relation to things that you have yourself experienced in the past, but also other people experience.
Now, can you also talk to us about stress and performance, let's say in the workplace? I've been obviously because of the lockdown, we've been quite stressful, not just with social life, but also in relation to workplace, because it's not really natural for us to work from home for many sectors. So, what's your take on that, stress and the workplace?
Again, that's a good question, and it's a very big and timely topic. So in terms of performance of what we would call white collar workers, so people like ourselves who would sit at a computer for most of the day, kind of doing whatever, is inherently difficult to measure compared to, for example, the blue collar workers. So if you're working in a factory, for example, in manufacturing, it's quite easy to measure the number of units you've made of a certain item per day as a measure of performance. But actually, when you're sat at a computer and you're replying to emails and you're talking to colleagues and you're reviewing documents and then talking to students like I do, it's quite hard to actually measure how productive you are being. So one of the key ways we do this is by asking people on a scale of 1 to 100, how productive have you been? Which isn't ideal because obviously self-report is not great. So that's one of the ways we measure performance. And then another way we think about performance is looking at things like presenteeism, which is being in work when you're not feeling well. So if you're not feeling well, obviously you're not concentrating as well as you could, you're potentially missing vital pieces of information. So kind of getting into the nitty gritty of what presenteeism is kind of helps us measure performance a little bit better as well. So they're the two kinds of measures that we use in our research to look at performance. And we know that for most people, stress and performance is highly correlated. So the more stressed you are, the worse your performance is going to be. But talking about this with one of my colleagues, he actually pointed out that he can be, that it could be the opposite way around for him. If he's very, very busy and very, very stressed and he's got a deadline, he can produce work at a higher rate. So it's not necessarily a linear association. So he's saying he can be very productive, but at the consequence of his mental health, if you see what I mean. So it's quite hard to kind of characterize this relationship between stress and performance. We do know that workplace stress is a key issue in the UK. So in 2018 and 2019, I think there was 602,000 working days lost in the UK, which equates to about £9 billion reduced from our economy. So this is, it's a key issue, workplace stress in the UK. And one of the streams of research that I've been working on even prior to COVID was the impact of remote working. So when you're at home or you're in the library or in a coffee shop, as I quite often am, how productive are you being? How good is that for your mental health? There's an interesting balance between not having to commute, so you don't have the pressure and stress of commuting. Between that and then also seeing your colleagues face to face is actually quite good if you get on with your colleagues for your kind of mental health and well-being, because that kind of personal interaction is really good in facilitating resilience and good mental health. So we've been doing some research on this with Nuffield Health, and some evidence kind of suggests that actually a sweet spot would be working at home 2 to 3 days a week and then being in the office the rest of the time. So that might be quite good. But it's certainly not a one boot fits all kind of approach, because different people work well at home and others not so well, and there's been some research linked to kind of personality types and whether your personality kind of fits a more secluded, isolated working environment compared to kind of being around your colleagues. So there's lots of interesting factors to consider here when it comes to stress and mental health. The other issue for the UK workforce is that our kind of estimated productivity, but again, productivity is very hard to measure, but our estimated productivity is estimated to be about 30% behind Germany and also about 30% behind the US. And our workplace stress is much higher. So I think that this kind of COVID time where everyone's been locked down and forced to kind of work from home, a lot of businesses and organisations have really kind of looked at this approach and saying, is this beneficial? Is it not beneficial? How are our employees kind of coping with stress during this time? Are they managing to maintain productivity? You know, what if they've got children that they're caring for? How are they managing to work? So we're currently doing quite a large survey on this at the moment with kind of people who are currently working from home, because we're quite interested to see kind of how they're managing during this time. And although this is kind of specific to the COVID lockdown, it does have implications for future home working. So like I said, a lot of businesses are kind of realising the benefits of home working. For example, they've got reduced costs if they're not having to pay for office space and car parking space for their employees. So I think that in the future we might see this kind of be more the norm than it has been before. So our research is going to be quite interesting in kind of laying down future directions and future kind of guidelines for how to effectively work from home, how to manage your well-being and managing your stress levels, but also maintaining a performance kind of.
That's certainly an interesting field of research that personally I'll be looking forward to, because I'm a freelancer. Whether there's COVID or not, I'm always working from home. It's by choice, because I'm an introvert. I thrive working on my own, and I also don't like commuting to London. It's so packed during the rush hour.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something about the workplace, and this actually reminds me of an article you've written on PsychCrunch about 2 years ago, and you said that email apps are actually preventing us from switching off. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this is really the concept that technology has advanced so much over the past kind of 2 decades that the working environment now is very different to what it was kind of 20 years ago. And in a way, it's very beneficial for us to be able to access our kind of work and our colleagues straight from our phone, which is always by your side, or your tablet. So actually, it's beneficial in a way because it helps you to integrate your work and your home life more effectively, which has been raised as an advantage by a number of high impact reports, so including the Marmot report, for example. But actually, an unintended consequence of this advancement in technology is that actually you can't ever switch off from work because it's always just there. It's right on my phone. I can't switch off from it. It's just, I need my phone. So there's this kind of idea kind of formulating that actually, because we're so accessible to work all the time, it's hard to switch off, and it's hard to kind of think about other things and effectively rest and recover. And actually, we know from the research that this is happening because quite a large study showed that many employees really feel compelled to respond to workplace messages, even during the evening and weekends when they should be resting and shouldn't be thinking about work. So we know that there's this kind of pressure to be responsive to work 24/7, and the motivation to be responsive might be quite different. So it might be like a cultural thing with your organization and kind of expectations set by managers to be responsive. And, you know, if your line manager is emailing you at all hours, you kind of feel like, oh, I should be working as well. So there's that kind of like email culture. But then also there's kind of intrinsic motivation. So if you want to show that you've got high work ethic and you want people to know that you're really putting your all into this work, you might be emailing your colleagues out of hours. So there's this kind of interesting theory that the evenings are very important for effective rest and recovery. So we know, for example, that kind of long periods away from work, so if you have your annual leave for 2 weeks, or if you have a nice long weekend off, employees, by the day they go back to work, they're feeling very well rested and very recovered. But there's quite good evidence that almost immediately their stress levels go straight back up. And actually what we see over the long term is more effective for maintaining low levels of mental health, of stress and good mental health, and also maintaining a good level of performance over the long term, is having these regular periods of rest and recovery. So having these evenings where you're completely disengaged from work and you exercise or spend time with family or read a book. If you're regularly doing this, we know that it's good for your mental health, it's good for your stress levels, and it's good for your productivity. So there's some interesting theories about why that might be, why the kind of this effective kind of regular short periods of recovery. So we know from some of our research research, for example, again coming back to the stress hormone cortisol, is that people who feel very stressed during the evenings and who aren't managing to disconnect from work, they have much higher levels of cortisol in their hair samples. So we know that their bodies are producing much more cortisol over the long term than people who are effectively managing to disengage. So so having your email apps connected to work on your phone and tablet can be potentially problematic. And what we know from a lot of qualitative research is that people who actually turn their notifications off from work, they actually report higher levels of well-being.
And I think it's also what works in the same vein with social media, you know, like with constant barrage of notification. When you're already in bed, that's kind of stressful as well when you're trying to go to sleep. So yeah, I suppose it really makes sense to try to switch off from email apps when you're already, you know, beyond office hours. Now, let's move on from workplace to students, because I understand that you also do a lot of work with exam stress, you know, helping students to manage stress.
Yeah, so this again is mainly the work of one of my colleagues. So kind of taking ideas from sports psychology and applying them to managing exam stress. So kind of, again, thinking about this kind of irrational belief. So thinking that, oh, I'm so stressed, if I fail my exam, my life is over. Actually, when you kind of sit down with students and you say, well, you know, let's think about this rationally. What does it really mean if you fail? You know, you're going to be able to resit. You're not going to fail your whole course. So kind of there's a movement to try and use some of these therapeutic approaches that are used in sport to kind of rationalize thoughts and feelings towards exam stress, to try and kind of reduce levels of exam stress.
So you've done a lot of work on stress and resilience and generally in mental health, but what is the most important thing you want the public to realize about your work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that levels of stress, mental health are extremely high. And we also know that they're underreported, so they're actually much higher than we think they are. It's been a real battle for many activists, clinicians over the past kind of decade to really bring mental health awareness to the forefront. And as a researcher, you know, I think that this is really important, and actually reducing stigma around mental health and stress is really important. And if people feel that they're able to talk about resilience, building resilience rather than dealing with stress, then that's fine. I think that's a good approach to take. But I think what I want people to take home is that this is something that affects almost everyone. At some point in their lives, they're going to feel stressed, and kind of an awareness of what that means for your well-being, for your mental health, is really important. And actually, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to look after yourself and prioritize yourself. So yeah, that would be my message.
And is there a particular individual or book which has the greatest influence to your work? You were talking earlier about you sort of take on stress is more biological, if I understand correctly. So what's the influence you in that?
That's a good question again.
I'm glad I prepared good questions.
Yeah, I mean, So who's influenced my work in stress the most?
Yeah, or is there a publication which is sort of like sits at the core of what you do?
There's a professor at Columbia University in New York called Catherine Monk, who's written a lot about early life stress and developmental psychopathology, and it's really reading her work that kind of sparked my interest in this. And she's written a lot about kind of trying to link this with evolutionary theory, so trying to marry up how we've evolved, how that actually might be different to the environment that we've evolved to thrive in a specific environment that we're currently not living in, because kind of our society and technology has advanced so much. We're not prepared kind of to live in this environment and thrive. And actually her kind of theories about actually why mental health disorders might be so prevalent kind of relate to this mismatch between kind of evolution and current situations. I think that, you know, reading a lot of her work really sparked my interest in this topic, and really kind of got me into this kind of anthropology, cognitive anthropology, really, that is something that I'd never kind of really been exposed to, but I find it really interesting. And I feel like now actually a lot of that work really influences how I think about lots of different types of problems and challenges. So stress in the workplace, for example. What is it about this workplace that we're finding particularly stressful? Well, we're not equipped and we're not evolved to deal with these types of emails, for example. This constant interruption is not good for our kind of cognitive processes, for our well-being and for our recovery. So kind of that evolutionary aspect has kind of really influenced a lot of my research.
That's really an interesting approach, what you just said, you know, like we have to take into account the evolutionary perspective when it comes to trying to address mental health. And yeah, it's really interesting, you know, like I read a piece of research that says about blue light. We're not really meant to be looking at light. I think that's one of you know, a potent example of what you're talking about, you know, taking about evolutionary approach to mental health. Well, now I want to ask you, Dr. Braithwaite, is I think you've come across with a number of misconceptions about stress. So if you could just sort of address those misconceptions about stress that you've come across with for the past decades that you've been, for the past years that you've been doing research on stress.
I think coming back to this, one of the misconceptions about stress is that stress is always bad. It's not necessarily always bad. Like I mentioned, this is an evolved mechanism that's helped us survive for hundreds of thousands of years as a species. And so kind of instantly saying, well, having a stress response is bad. No, it's not. And in lots of situations, it can be very adaptive. So like I mentioned before, kind of helping you deal with future stress by adapting to your current and previous stressful experiences. So I think that that kind of concept that stress is always bad is been kind of misinterpreted a lot. But actually, that's not such a good public health message, because you don't want to say to people, oh, it's okay to be a bit stressed, because that's quite confusing. So it's an interesting concept, thinking about stress. And actually, one of the things that's difficult in stress research is to really define what you mean when you say stress. There's lots of different types of stress. There's lots of kind of symptoms, both physical and mental, of stress. So really trying to hone in on what stress is important, so that you can really kind of place your research in alignment with what other people have done. So that's why a lot of my research is really focused on depression and anxiety as a clinical disorder, rather than just feelings of stress, because they can manifest in lots of different symptoms.
And for those of us who's interested about finding more about stress and resilience, can you recommend a good psychology book to start off?
There's a really good book called Mismatch by Gluckman and Hansen. So that really outlines this kind of evolutionary theory that I've been talking about, how we're mismatched between our environment and what we've evolved for. So I definitely think that that is a good starting point.
I'll put that on the description box, so for anyone who's interested about finding more about stress, mismatch, I'll put that. And of course, I need to ask you this. So what's your distressing outlet? What other interests do you have other than psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I've always played a lot of sport. I played netball and squash and cycling, but I actually had a baby about a year ago, so that I'm not doing so much of that now, because I'm spending a lot of my time looking after him. So that's really good. And I really like just being outdoors. I love going walking. I don't live that far from North Wales, so there's some good beaches and good mountains for lots of walking and cycling. So I quite like just getting out, getting back to nature and doing some exercise outdoors.
We all love it, going back to what we do before the lockdown. Finally, Dr. Braithwaite, what else is in the pipeline? Do you have any upcoming webinar, or do you have any other interesting project that you're working on?
We've got quite a few interesting projects actually on the go at the moment, and we're doing a project with astronauts from the European Space Agency. So this is again a little bit different to what I'm kind of used to doing, but as kind of space exploration is anticipated to increase quite a bit over the next coming few decades, with kind of SpaceX trying to get to Mars and all this. A lot of research is going into kind of optimizing well-being and resilience of astronauts who might potentially be spending very long periods of time in space. Now, currently, astronauts are usually from a military background, and they do a lot of training. They do one kind of trip to the space station or whatever they're doing, and then they don't do any more. But kind of the future aspirations is that people might be going back and forth to space multiple times. So one of the things that we're interested in about is how do astronauts transition to the space environment and then back to the home environment and then to space again, which might be quite stressful going from one environment to the other. So we're doing some work with, like I said, the European Space Agency and NASA, who have a training station in Russia where they do confinement training. So astronauts go and spend 6 to 12 months isolated in this kind of training station, and they do lots of kind of things that they might be doing on a space mission, so kind of practicing these different things. So we're going to be doing some work with these astronauts, so measuring their stress levels during this kind of training, measuring their resilience, their teamwork, all kinds of things, and then also thinking about how they then transition from this very isolated environment back into their home life. So kind of trying to understand how to effectively transition between these very extreme environments. It's a really interesting kind of new piece of research that we're just starting now.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about that. But it's been an insightful conversation with you, Dr. Braithwaite. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise, talking to us about stress, workplace, and of course, anxiety. I look forward to hearing more about your work, and thank you.
Thank you for having me on.